Welcome to the Tank Magazine podcast. Today, we'll be listening back to a conversation hosted at Tank as part of our book talk series between poet and lecturer Nisha Ramayya and Eley Williams to discuss Nisha's new collection, States of the Body, Produced by Love. Out with Ignota Books, the collection is an evocative and incisive reflection on diasporic identity and how language can be a site of both power and playful conjuration.
Thank you. Off the back of that, I'd probably just ask Nisha to say, you're going to be reading from this book. Could you give some context of the readings that you've chosen for this evening? Is there an order to it? Is there an arc to the extracts you're going to be reading?
Yeah, well, so Ellie and I met almost 10 years ago, and we came together through our shared love of dictionaries and lexicography and etymology and philology. And so I thought that I would do a sort of trajectory of my kind of explorations and adventures through the study of the Indo-European language family, to kind of trying to find connections between Sanskrit and English, and the sort of conflicts and, I don't know, some of the kind of queries that came up through that journey. So yeah, it's going to have a lexicographical focus, so I hope that appeals to the audience.
I like the way you describe it as we met that way, as if I was reaching for a dictionary, you just also going for it. I was like, what are you interested in? Words? What's that about?
Well, I have this memory of you running to me with a copy of George Bataille's Encyclopedia Asyphalica.
Was I going to swat something?
Yeah.
I don't really run, so I don't think that was me. Sweet of you to think that. And we've done events together at Dr. Johnson's house, kind of riffing on the idea of some monolithic but also quasi-monomaniacal keeper of language, someone who attempts to register or fix the English language as a project, that one man could attempt to do that. And I know through your studies, you then were also looking at another particular man who seemed to be trying to find a way of, if not fixing language, then work out a balance of languages. Could you say more about that figure in your work?
Yeah, well, I can actually, I could introduce him through the reading, because, so one of the key figures in my books is Sir Monier Williams, who, as you'll find out, he compiled the most used Sanskrit English dictionary, and I sort of developed a relationship with him through the course of my studies. And yeah, I can maybe begin by
That'd
reading
be great.
that.
Yeah,
And
yes, please.
also, I hope you don't mind, but I usually stand when reading, so I'm gonna. So actually, this piece I'm going to begin with was one of the things that I was writing when we met, and then we were doing these projects at Dr. Johnson's house. And in the rainstorm. In 1755, lexicographer Samuel Johnson made his great attempt to fix or embalm the English language. Sometime during his decade-long labor, he realized the impossibility of the task, as he recalls in the preface to A Dictionary of the English Language. He says, "Total and sudden transformations of a language seldom happen. Conquests and migrations are now very rare, but there are other causes of change which, though slow in their operation and invisible in their progress, are perhaps as much superior to human resistance as the revolutions of the sky or intumescence of the tide." His comments were prescient. 30 years after his dictionary was published, a cataclysm broke upon the English language. Johnson believed that English was primarily derived from Roman and Teutonic languages, but in 1786, philologer Sir William Jones discovered that the branches extended much further. He proposed that ancient Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, Persian, Gothic, and Celtic languages shared a linguistic source, and what is now known as the Indo-European language family began to take root. Oriental, or Selim Jones, as he was nicknamed, extended the study to include the religions associated with these ancient and classical languages. Distant cultures became comparable as linguistic and mythological distinctions were swept by tides. East and West were not as disparate as supposed. By placing Dievs, Pitre, Zeus, Pater, and Jupiter alongside one another, Jones discovered the multiplicity of the Sky Father. And the whole earth was of one language. Are Abraham and Sarah versions of Brahma and Saraswati? Is Zeus, Isis, Jesus, Krishna, Christ? I began the study of Sanskrit after a friend told me that this ancient language is poetry itself. Imagine the correct words breaking loose, line breaks arranging themselves in the burble. The terms of the promise are manifest. Sanskrit, Samskrita, well-formed perfection of the gods, the beauty of artifice, hallowing convention, preserving numbers, names of rivers, and the rounded shapes of the aftersound. I am not alone in the sanctum sanctorum, nor free from intrusion. The 19th century lexicographer Sir Ramayya Williams, author of a Sanskrit-English dictionary, guides me through the language like poetry. I crouch in definitions, dragging lamps. So he, in the preface to the dictionary, I'm skipping a tiny bit, but in the preface to the dictionary, Sir Ramayya Williams explains his approach to compiling this dictionary and his objectives. So he says, what we assert is that the national character is cast in a Sanskrit mold, and that the Sanskrit language and literature is not only the key to a vast and apparently confused and unmeaning religious system, but it is also the one medium of approach to the hearts of the Hindus, however unlearned or however disunited by the various circumstances of country, caste, and creed. It is, in truth, even more to India than classical and patristic literature was to Europe at the time of the Reformation. It gives a deeper impress to the Hindu mind than the latter ever did to Europeans, so that a missionary at home in Sanskrit will be at home in every corner of our vast Indian territories. I am at home in a language that is not my own. When I work in Sanskrit, I lose myself in the dictionary's words. When I hear him speak, I forget the sound of my own voice. How could it be otherwise? I can only get to the language by means of the dictionary. Ramayya Williams makes the connection. He whispers in my ear as Sanskrit speaks. This is my home, but he opens the door to let me in. My knowledge of Sanskrit will never exceed his. My love of Sanskrit will never be separate from him. I am not at home in this language, although I should be, if nomen est omen is as heavy as it sounds. My name is Sanskrit. I ask Ramayya Williams what I mean. Nisha, feminine, night, a vision, dream, turmeric, confer with nak and nakti, or Avestan, nakt, uru, or Greek, nux, Latin, nox, Lithuanian, nactis, Slavic, noshti, Gothic, nats, Anglo-Saxon, neacht, nicht, English, night, German, nacht. Listen closely. The one language speaks in scattered tongues. Should I keep?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of that way of seeing, I'm going to join you. We'll do another one up, one down. In terms of seeing Sanskrit then as they're positioned as a home of language, that doesn't necessarily mean comfort there. There's something about recognition and there's something about familiarity, but reading your amazing book that contains both poetry and poetic language in a kind of essayistic, supple and slippery form, I never feel like you're necessarily saying that this Ramayya Williams dictionary has solved kind of language for you or has provided a final ballast or resting place for what language or relationship with language can mean for you. Is that fair to say?
Well, I think that when I wanted to start studying Sanskrit, I realized that the way that I had to study, and also I did evening classes at SOAS, and this was the dictionary that we were set on the syllabus, and that it was a dictionary that was created with the express purpose of as a sort of colonial instrument and for the kind of conversion of the natives, and also to try and as part of other colonial apparatus. But I loved it. I loved the dictionary. I loved flicking through it. The definitions often are like poetry, where you begin with a word and then a list of related words, and then always, as it repeats throughout the book, but always names of rivers, names of flowers, lunar mansions, it sort of was the thing that made me think about how I could love something that was in some way created to destroy me or some kind of sense of my past. That was kind of, it made me think about what it means to love language, but also hate certain things about it, the kind of always contradictory experiences of love, and also of home. So home being, on one hand, something comforting or familiar, or a place where you might feel safe, also sometimes a place where you don't feel safe, where you feel the least safe. So it set up those kinds of contradictions that I wanted to explore further.
And I know that you've written in the book the lexicographer as priest, that role being explored as, the word priest can have cognates of saviour as much as it is about curation and more sinister ownership and corralling a congregation and having power over them. How far did you feel in writing this that you were kind of singling yourself out from a congregation, or putting yourself in opposition to a lexicographer?
Well, I think one of the things I was trying to do, I could read that poem actually, but one of the things also was trying to appropriate the power of the priest and the lexicographer, because they are authority figures. So it's trying to actually impersonate them in some ways. So sometimes that's what I often speak in the voice of Samuel Johnson or Eley Williams or various other kind of authority figures, like from intellectual or colonial history. And it's just somehow, if I embody them and I speak them, it's another way of gaining power and maybe reclaiming something, but also maybe sort of revealing, like kind of demystifying, I suppose, right, and revealing the kind of the operations at work.
Would it be all right if you did read that? Would that fit in a schedule?
The lexicographer priest. Myths are distributed, authored by atmosphere. The goddess disappears underground. How unexpected to attend to the satellite. Yad e hasti tad anyantra yan ne hasti na tad kvachit. What is here is there. What is not here is nowhere. The river is tangled in nomenclature. Prakriti, Sarasvati, Vach, blowing out of course, subject to the curves of the shell. Boundless and destitute, characterized by daring, her body contradicts the definition. Coated in white petals, tied, bound, she awaits the synonymous burst. Presume the sea, presume the swell, the force of documentary proof. Defined by putting together, bringing in close connection, nam, nam, mala, string of beads, lexicon. Words are lotus flowers looped on a wreath, the familiarity of the image cocoons. Soft cups possessed by the line uphold the agreement made to caprice. He makes boxes and sheaths for seed vessels, syllables bloom and smile, liberated by dark corners. These are monuments to fragility in an ambiguous resting ground. Words show through the page where they should not. One surpasses pearls, the other dances. There was no death in the family. Expiations went unperformed, the river deemed redundant. See who stands in front of you, see who was never there. Lines drawn in shadow, passages undercut. Etymology is placing white crowns on confluence. Johnson says, "It is remarkable that in reviewing my collection, I found the word sea unexemplified. Apara, not having an opposite shore, the prefix a negates the beyond. Apara, para, that which will not acquiesce. Daramga, a crossgoer, a wave, billow. Daramga malin, the sea as garlanded by waves. Bandha, binding, fixing, bandage, chain, there is no use, conferring. Madhya, used like medius, earth as a woman's body, the sea as her waist. Ratna nidhi, the place where pearls are kept. This vessel is the final resting place before the ocean churns. Johnson says, if the changes that we fear be thus irresistible, what remains but to acquiesce with silence, as in the other insurmountable distresses of humanity? It remains that we retard what we cannot repel, that we palliate what we cannot cure. Life may be lengthened by care, though death cannot be ultimately defeated. Tongues, like governments, have a natural tendency to degeneration. We have long preserved our constitution. Let us make some struggles for our language. Mahipa, earth protector, conversant with words, compiling defeat and invention. The lexicographer exhales, grasping the fix as it blossoms. So many things lost in the deluge, how strangely they hold up in light.
And do you feel with that poem has words to do with ambiguity, to do with it's mentioned the degeneration of tongues. And if I think of the cultural artifact of a dictionary, I'm looking for something fixed, for something true, for something simply stated as this means that. How far do you see ambiguity as part of this project, as kind of the requirement of saying, looking for fixity and looking for registered language that can be meted out from an immutable source of truth is actually an impossibility, is a very human requirement to have a tool that can explain language in that way, but actually is a kind of fool's errand?
Well, I mean, I think that it also has to do with a dictionary of Sanskrit is not a dead language. It is very much in use, but it's not an everyday language. It's a sacred language, but it is going back to something, especially, and for me as well as a first generation born here Indian. It's going back. It's going to another place. So there's already movement, and I think that if you're going back to something, you can't just leave it there. You have to see what happens when you bring it over here. I, as a woman, would not have been. It's a language that was passed down between men. I've tried to populate it. Eley Williams was quite he abhorred goddesses, especially tantric goddesses with their blood and their kind of breasts and their wild hair. He found that actually one of the things he loathed most and most wanted to sort of cure about Hindus, who otherwise, I mean, he also found lots of things he loved about Hindus, and he focuses on Hindus in India. And so I find it something, there's a pleasure in kind of populating the dictionary with these bloody goddesses. So my cover goddess is Chinnamasta, who is a tantric goddess, and she exists in Buddhist traditions as well. And she cuts off her head to feed herself and her loved ones. But she's a very messy, she's a messy goddess. And I kind of like the idea of the dictionary kind of spattered with blood. And so fixity, I don't know. Also, I mean, I feel that I have to say as well that part of one, maybe if I read things from later on in the book, parts of the journey that I'm sort of on is thinking about Sanskrit and what it means to study Sanskrit, and in the rise of Hindu nationalism and the way that Sanskrit, what that means to learn it or be forced to learn it or refuse to learn it in India. It's a very different context from me studying it at SOAS. So I had to think about that. So that sort of complicated, but it also made me not want to hold on to anything, not to refuse the fixity.
Did that feel freeing or also like chaos? Like if there is no fixity, if there is no sure land, then that doesn't mean necessarily that you can feel empowered all the time. It can also feel like, well, that maybe it's meaninglessness, and the attempts to parse existence or communicate clearly is actually impossible. Does that then mean that it fringes for you onto a kind of sacred truth or truthiness? Or is that to say, like, well, no, that's why we use myths to explain things more usefully, perhaps, than having set down regimented language as in a dictionary?
Maybe it's like both immersing oneself in all of these like different stories and traditions and myths and cultures, immersing oneself and being completely flooded and overwhelmed and kind of drowning. And so it's that constant like asking, you know, I don't know, there's one poet who I love, Susan Howe, who's an American poet. She writes that she goes to libraries because they are the ocean for her, and I feel like that about dictionaries. I go to this Sanskrit English dictionary because it's the ocean, which is vast and terrifying, and I quickly go under.
And do you, before in a discussion we were saying that, is it elephants and clouds? Is that right? In dictionaries kind of share this relationship with each other as words and their etymologies. I would say curdle, because that seems like a cloud-based thing. I don't know what, rampage as well towards one another, like elephants. Could you kind of say more about that the way that the history of words and their etymology, the way that they're formed, how that informs your writing or your thinking about lexicography?
Yeah, well, I could again like read an extract in response to that.
That'd be amazing.
And then no more readings. But there's a part at the end of the book where I kind of set in contrast the things that I'm terrified about with regards to Sanskrit and then the things that I most love. So maybe I'll just read those to kind of conclude the reading part. And actually I'll open maybe with a kind of ritualistic beginning of death and rebirth. From ocean, from abandonment, from unoriginality, from depending on the position of the planets, the explainers, their promises, the nonce borrowed defenses, the walls they outline on your belly and back, from your poster paint instincts, your woodblock chorus, the compulsion to ask for help, green and purple neck feathers dipped in salt water, liminal itch driven to spurt, from the severed totalities of other tongues to the quick of being recalled. I, dictionary, I'm going to die. I will be testudinius. So I've killed the dictionary, but it's going to be reborn. And so this is, I was reading lots of Franz Fanon, and he writes about the tower of the past and what gets happened when you seal yourself away in the tower of the past. And it sort of obstructs self-creation, self-definition, connection and emancipation. So I was thinking about what happens when I go back to India, like historically, geographically, culturally, and emotionally, what I find, what I leave behind, what I retrieve, what my relationship is to this tower of the past. When I think of the tower of the past, it is inscribed with the script found on statite steels in the Indus Valley, markers of a South Asian civilization thought to be contemporaneous and technically commensurate with ancient urban cultures in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and China. The script is not yet deciphered, which is not to say that it hasn't been translated. The tower is inscribed with Sanskrit, which sits very proudly upon the topmost aerial roots of trees, looking down like gods, as origins do. The tower is engraved with warrior postures, chess pieces, unicorns, and perfect circles upon lonely places, upon knots, upon crosses, upon crossed arms. The tower is built on the site of a mosque. It is built on the border between India and Pakistan, on the line of control between the parts of Jammu and Kashmir controlled by the Indian and Pakistani militaries. The tower is built to distract from the dying and dead bodies on both sides of the border to which it calls attention. It stands to attention, casting its shadow upon contested sites. The tower is inscribed with an undeciphered script that right-wing Hindus translate as evidence of their divine origins, of their twice-born status and right to rule, of their racial purity and essential nationality. Right-wing Hindus instrumentalize the goddess in the form of the Saraswati River to erase histories of movements and mixtures as part of an ongoing process to displace and dispossess Muslims, Dalits, indigenous people, and marginalized social, religious, and political groups, symbolically and literally. Sanskrit is weaponized. Its ums and ahas that sounded to me like a chorus of laughter, a string of pearls, a source of pride and spiritual scaffolding, turned to bile and blood in my mouth, turned to dying and dead bodies in my mouth. The chorus sings, how many people died building the tower? Drink water before saying her names, before praying. Rinse your mouth after singing, after eating. Spit after speaking, after praying. Will you eat with me? Will you hold me in your arms after I'm done? Why do you hold me after you're gone? There is a curious association between clouds and elephants. Admittedly, they share characteristics. Their towering greyness, their obdurate disposition to hold or release water, still they do not feel comfortable together. Something about the glorious earthiness of one, the frustrating unearthliness of the other. An unlikely myth reveals that elephants were once winged, roving the sky like clouds. They stopped to rest on a tree beneath which the sage Dirgataba sat to teach. But the branches could not withstand their clumsy weight and crashed to the ground, killing several of the ascetic students. The furious long in time and space austerities cursed them, as sages in Indian mythology are wont to do. Now elephants can no longer fly or float or metamorphose, but their vaporish origins are preserved in language. The harata, the chataka bird, fond of raindrops. Proud cuckoo, only drinking water as it falls from the sky. A cloud filled with drops, a furious elephant emitting rot fluid. Ghana, ghana, said of an elephant, compact, thick, a cloud, mutual collision or contact. Another shared feature, the sound when they clash. Marala, a horse, an elephant, a grove of pomegranate trees, white oleander, a villain, a cloud, lamp black. Redness mixed with a little yellow. A helpful definition or not, depending on how you see it. The components are of a myth whereby the horse and elephant are true friends who don't know it till the end. The scene is red with a little yellow mixed in. Matamga, going willfully or roaming at will, an elephant, a cloud. Nabho gaja, sky elephant, a cloud. Satri, one who is accustomed to perform sacrifices, an elephant, a cloud. Shveta, white, dressed in white, moonstone, snow mountain, a bright side glance, a white cloud, of a mythical elephant, of the mother of the elephant after she died, buttermilk and water mixed half and half. In the evenings, we played Eartha Kitt records before returning to the brightest place.
And do you find, at the beginning of that extract, you mentioned nonce words. So for those that don't know, a nonce word is a word that is used for one particular event. It's kind of a spontaneous word that is required newly from language to be applied to a certain event. I think a recent example, not a particularly good one, was when Ed Miliband said omnishambles about what was going on in Parliament. I'm sure you can think of much better examples. But how far do you think that language requires refreshment? That, you know, you mentioned that Sanskrit is not a dead language and shouldn't be thought of as such. But how far would you feel confident creating new words for new affects and effects and realities?
Well, lots of writers do, and one thing with Sanskrit is that, as I understand, they, rather than create new words, they create new compounds in order to create new meanings. Or a word is introduced from English to try and kind of fill in a gap. Something I was thinking about with the OED, now that it's online, it's sort of the potential is unlimited as far as the potential of the internet is unlimited, has unlimited capacity. So the OED kind of can continue to expand in a way that I wonder if it happens at a faster rate than when it was bound by the books. You would know more about that than I would.
You would know.
But I think personally, for some reason I'm more drawn to compound and juxtaposition. Maybe that's the sort of, and I don't quite feel like an authority figure enough to make up my own word. And
it's weird, the idea of making up a word and then attempting to trace one's ownership or power over it, as if that it couldn't be some kind of fragile but easily tossed around thing that other people should be able to use and misuse as and when it's useful. And similarly, like those of you that have used the Urban Dictionary and how that's changed in terms of editorial probity. Before anyone could just upload something and say, you know, a Nisha means a whatever, probably profane reality. And then, but now there is an editorial board that checks to make sure that Nisha hasn't already been installed as a word that means something in kind of current discourse.
Yeah.
And I mean, notions of what is the difference between the Queen's English or slang and nonce words and evanescent words and errors. I mean, certainly in terms of the Oxford English Dictionary, in the first edition, they had the adjective American, but they didn't have the adjective African because they thought that one was a useful word and the other wasn't, which is just some hideous colonial notion of what proper English would require, and is oversight, but indicative of what the kind of politics of lexicography might be. They also, because it was a physical thing rather than online and kind of expansive as long as it had to be, if there's an entry, I think it was for the noun bondmaid, which we use every day, right? That entry that was written on a little index card had slipped behind the filing cabinet, so it just didn't make it into the first edition. And you wonder how many words could just slip out every day out of discourse, out of currency, and we wouldn't miss them because we didn't know to miss them, really.
I really, like, when I was looking up nonce words for something for Eley, and
I like to live it large.
A special treat for Eley. And I found the word delphinestrian, so a dolphin rider, and it did. I had like, oh,
It's me.
yeah. What led that word to being included in the dictionary?
Right.
It seems, yeah. It seems like they conjured something by coming up with that particular word, and now it exists.
Right.
Even if really there's no kind of trace other than the word.
Yeah. And now that you know it, you almost want to seek out that reality. You want to see someone riding on a dolphin down Great Portland Street and be like, oh, I've got your number. Like, I understand what's going on. In case someone, a delphinestrian, in case a delphinestrian is going past and wants to ask a question, we have got time now for questions for Nisha about her book. I think there is a roving microphone that can be summoned. But if someone does have a question, please do raise a hand. Suddenly people are touching their ears, which makes you go like that. And yeah.
What you were just discussing reminds me of, you know, when you search a word, you can kind of see the arc of how popular it's been used, you know, in the last 150 years, which is like one of my favourite games. Again, living at large. I wonder if you know how these kinds of things are tracked and arbitered, and sort of where that kind of data around, like, you know, which essentially which keeps those words alive and sort of tracks how they're living and surviving. I wonder if, you know, how that works, I guess. And who gets to sort of, and what do you think provokes these kinds of spikes, you know, where words kind of come into fashion, and what are the kind of forces, I guess, at play?
Right, it's so strange when you look at, trying to think of an example, the adjective mammoth, you think must be related to some kind of archaeological dig or kind of the study of whatever, Paleolithic, I'm going to use the wrong word, so apologies to everyone. But it's from the 19th century, and it was an adjective that was applied to a kind of cheese that was made by lots of women in the US for the president who was going to visit, and they said, like, I'm going to create a mammoth cheese, and that's the first use of it. And you think it must be older than that. This must just be the first recorded use. So who was the arbiter to say that this was the first kind of evanescent blossoming of this word that means anything? And so often with dictionaries, especially with the OED, that's often seen as the kind of greatest example, at least in English, of that kind of project. it has claims to being a democratic process, so it would ask people to send in examples of when they first saw that word in print, to have a sense of when it did feature in language and become, to use the words of Johnson, as is in your book, embalmed there. But with that embalming process, there's a power dynamic, right? Like someone decided to register that. I don't know how lexicographers nowadays would be able to keep that. There must be an algorithm for it. One of the editors of the OED, Frederick Furnivall, he was a big fan of, in making these little index cards for the OED that would go into pigeonholes and then would be filed away to make the body of the dictionary, rather than copying out from a text where he first saw the use of a word, he would just rip it out of the book. And he worked at Oxford University with all these priceless manuscripts, and he just was like, oh, brilliant, this is the first time I've ever seen kind of gouge, rip it out, stick it on. All these interns or equivalent just looking at him in horror. And I don't know, with Ramayya Williams, do you know what the process was of compiling the dictionary? Was it him versus the world, or did he have
he had native informants, definitely. Like he did,
really?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. He talks about.
Is that his word for them? Like native informants?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but it was just. I mean, also, I guess in terms of like words falling out of favor, it just makes me think also of the kind of feminist projects and kind of anti-colonial or decolonial projects to kind of take certain words out of use. And like I was just thinking. I had some former student, Nadif and I were just talking about a course that we've both taught on at different times, and called vernacular writing, and I had some great proactive students who were looking into the history of the word mumbo jumbo, and it's extremely racist origins, and the fact that it refers to something kind of it just is an example of a colonial attitude that now kind of imbues the word, and it's completely removed it from context as if it was like an artifact. And yeah, so like sometimes, I don't know, there's something interesting about things falling out of favor or kind of it coming out of the currency, which is sometimes an active project. Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, writers such as Mary Daly writing her, was it Webster's Dictionary? Wikidary, that was the one. And that was a project, and it was playful, but a project in highlighting how patriarchal strictures had winnowed language of an appreciation of what a kind of female influence etymology brings to language and experience. So for example, the word spinster, why is it that we have these negative connotations for it, when actually it could be defined in terms of spinning and useful both economic labor but also storytelling, and more playfully taking words like remember and kind of riffing on the idea of the member is part of this. Why is this phallus in my dictionary? Why is memory to do with members? Similarly, you have Monique Wittig writing the materials for a lesbian dictionary, which is imagining this fantasy island where it's just women that live there, and then imagining if that island did exist, what would their encyclopedia look like? How would that change? And again, it is playful and it's speculative, and it's not claiming to be a kind of dry work of scholarship by any means, but this reimagining of what language could be or what it could stand for is a way of seeing activism through lexicography, and rather than seeing it as something bound by scholarship and the past, as actually, as you mentioned in that last extract, something that is generative for a future revelry of language, without it being indulgent or full of stricture. Are there any other questions? This one at the back.
I'm going to ask a bit of a sprawling question, thinking of one of my favourites of your works, which is called Future's Flowers, and perhaps you might treat us to a reading of it. But I was kind of wondering if you could speak to the relationship between semanticity and mantra, and how that might then constellate to themes of love and devotion in your work, and also ritual, repetition, and sacrifice. Just an easy one there.
Well, so I think most of the things that I've read so far tonight are prose pieces, but I don't know if it came out or not, but one of the things that I try to do is build in rhythms into prose, so that there's some sort of kind of, maybe something that resonates a little bit with chanting or other kind of traditional poetic forms, both in English but also Sanskrit metrical forms, but sort of built into the kind of scaffolding, if you like, and structures of prose. And how that relates to because I mean, in like tantric traditions, you say mantras and they kind of resonate with chakras in different parts of your body. So there is, I think that's part of why always sound is so important to everything that I write. It's part of emphasizing sound, and the kind of acoustic qualities of things is also part of a kind of rejection of a kind of hierarchy where the visual comes at the top and reading and text comes at the top, and that's trying to kind of which is also kind of related to like Western European kind of modes of knowledge, and that's kind of what one Sanskrit scholar talks about. In Latin, the emphasis was on reading and text and literacy. With Sanskrit, the emphasis is on orality and sound. And so that's part of, that's maybe, I don't know if that relates, the somaticism and ritual. So it's kind of, I try to build it into everything that I do, because that's an ongoing project, I think, to kind of, but I would relate it to sound and oral. Yeah, I don't know. Does that answer at all? Or what? I could, yeah.
It's interesting, as you were saying that I think Denise Riley has written that meaning has sense in the mouth, and the idea that it's only through almost chewing through language that you're able to almost tease what could be meant in a meaningful way, rather than just receive it as kind of a glyphic rune or truth that then you pass on to someone else.
Yeah, and and feel it in the body.
Right, it becomes a somatic and as well as a semantic kind of impulse.
I guess that's another feminist project of embodied knowledge. Or okay, so this is Futures Flowers, and all of my work somehow nods to Eley Williams. So there's a love scene between albatrosses.
What are you saying about my private life stays private. That's what.
Which is for Eley. Okay. Futures, flowers. You want to imagine futures. You want to create futures objects in your mind and to hold them there until your mind turns into the shapes of these objects. The practice of imagining turns into the rightness of action according to the metaphysics of the ritual, so that flowers formed by the hands become the fruits of the practice, become abolition's efflorescence. The ritual must be repeated until it turns on itself, its objects destroying their causality. You turn on yourself, move into the void in yourself, and begin. The red door to the temple is guarded by 2 elephants, both vomiting rainbows. Their vomit meets in the sky above them and fuses to form a lunette. The lunette is decorated with brides-to-be standing a corpse width apart. One is to be enjoyed, one worshipped only. The brides are protected by lions, who are nothing like the real police sitting across the street from the real temple. They protect and enforce the reality that requires them. You do not require them. You prefer these lions who prop open their mouths with the heads of your enemies. You decide to substitute yourself for your enemies, abolishing liberalism by means of liberalism, placing your head in the lion's mouth. Lying between the brides, you realize that your body is corpse width. Yours is the corpse by which you must enter. Past the first hurdle, you throw colored powders at the space where the door should be, trying to make it appear in your mind. It's a jeweled throne on an island of butter in the ocean of milk. It's a forest of the lotus of the heart that abides in the citadel. It's a red door to a temple in the cremation ground inside your body. Mind guards the door to consciousness. The colored powders fall into a geometric pattern on the ground of being and non-being. You lie down and puff your way in. It's easy. You make it all the way, breaking through 3 straight lines, discontinuing tenses. Blow time out of mind, let futures flowers. Another line appears, a dark line formed by a cloud's shadow. The cloud rearranges itself in the sky. It's an elephant. It's your mind stuck in mind. The dark line marks its time of death. The elephant bursts into hundreds of thousands of silvery spheres. You stand in the shadows, looking up, mouth wide open in awe of futurity. You swallow spheres, internalize obstacles that you may pass them through your body, pass memories of elephants, pass clouds. The line increases and covers ground. It's the side of a circle accounting for error. The circumference is planted with golden arms reaching upwards, stretching to hold each other's hands at the apex. You know there are no multicolored hands around the world. There are oceans of wine surrounding mountains of flesh. Nevertheless, you visualize a circle of arms raising a cone of power, vitriol crystallizing into bluestone. True solidarity is a beautiful and charmingly corrosive process. What if the future is faceless? Return to the shadows. You project your shadows onto the clouds, casting your self-esteem, all those little mothers, into outer space. Mind rays alight. Little mothers carry lamps out of your body and up to the stars. Infatuated with darkness, you resist their advice. Luminosity is the state of things that are luminous and also of things that are dark. You want to be left alone with your mind rays, a cosmic puppet dangling in the grandeur of the inner void, your desirelessness. But you are surrounded by kissy noises, resonating concentrically. Everyone and everything is kissing except you. Your mouth is stuffed full of flowers, and even these flowers are kissing each other inside your mouth, as if you were simply a space in which desire takes place. You struggle to imagine kissing from the perspective of your mouth. Your tongue is a brazen plate, struck by lightning and struck and struck. You know that subtle sounds are better, unstruck sounds are best, and bite down on your tongue. You bite off the head of your enemy and join in with anticipation. The cracks in the walls of the temple are stuffed with little yellow chrysanthemums. You remove these flowers and destabilize the temple in your mind in your race to one-pointed consciousness, which is the brain-facing lotus at the crown of your skull. The crown hides a hole into which sky drips, feeding the 1,000-petaled lotus that blooms behind and occasionally into and out of your eyes, your ears, your mouth. Feel the petals tickle your mind when you shake your head out of time. Feel the roots of the lotus penetrate the wet soil of sky and spread into the infinite wetness of space. No, not yet. The temple stands. You must grasp the triangles, for one who is not a triangle must not worship triangles. The lines and angles suggest hundreds of thousands of awkward bodies, golden arms, sword fighting, sunbeams, laser quests, illuminated parts. But you strive for unbroken light, sectionless consciousness, sparkling waves of bliss. The triangles exist in another dimension. They cast shadows in the shape of cubes, in the shape of spheres. Cast these shadows upon your body, cover your body in perfect solids. How absurd, the masters say, to spread perfection on your body like jam on bread. But you delight in hyperreality, this calculated immersion in pleasure. You pass yourself through your body without breaking your body. You make your shadows dance. Your shadows hold hands, rub beaks, play footsie, wind tails together, totter rosily, cheek to cheek, bumpity bump, bump, bump. They circle each other, full body bobbing. They take each other by surprise, stand to attention, and stargaze. The absolute soul of the universe is an assemblage of migratory birds whose agitation is indeed creation. You understand that when they say they dream to change the world, what they really mean is that they sleep badly. You say something about sleeping badly, the death of death whose destruction is liberation. You say nothing about the seeds in your heart, the roots creeping into your circulatory system, the seedlings poking out of your center of consciousness. In truth, your desires are infinite, your actions infinitesimal. You are as close as you can get to the center before sneezing. The temple inside you implodes in a mess of chromation ash, yellow pollen, third eye twinkle, and sonic dot. You are as far away as you can get from the world without renouncing it. Opposing yourself, you do all this as an offering to me, these flowers formed by the hands, this worship through the flesh, these lightning flashes of social life, this rhythm through rightness and opposition. You turn out of these objects, turning out.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is taken from Waiting Games by Kate Simcoe and the London Electronic Orchestra.